We all have a version of ourselves we present to the world, a polished, curated image that we hope will pass for the truth, but I've spent 30 years looking people in the eye and seeing the cracks in the porcelain. You see, the truth isn't just a set of facts, it's an energy, and when someone is living a lie, they leak that lie from every pore, they vibrate with it. I could see it the moment Elena walked into my dressing room before the cameras even started rolling. She was dressed like a woman who had it all together, a crisp white blouse, expensive heels, hair perfectly coiffed, but her eyes were darting around like a trapped animal looking for an exit that didn't exist. She wasn't just hiding a secret, she was drowning in it, and my job wasn't just to pull her out of the water, but to make her realize she was the one who had jumped in with weights tied to her ankles. People often ask me what I'm looking for in those first few seconds of meeting someone. I'm looking for the delta, that gap between who they say they are and who they actually are. Elena was a 42-year-old mother of three from a quiet, affluent neighborhood in suburban Chicago. On the surface, she was the PTA president, the woman who organized the bake sales, the wife of a successful architect named David. She was the person everyone looked up to as the gold standard of modern motherhood. But as I sat there, watching her fidget with a heavy gold bracelet on her wrist, I didn't see a gold standard. I saw a woman who was terrified that the house of cards she had spent 15 years building was about to be blown down by a single breath of reality. She had come to me under the guise of wanting help for her rebellious teenage daughter, Chloe. That was the ticket she used to get in the door. She told my producers that Chloe was out of control, stealing, lying, and destroying the family peace. But within 5 minutes of talking to Elena in the hallway, I knew Chloe wasn't the primary patient. Chloe was the symptom, Elena was the disease. It's a classic move. Find a scapegoat, point the finger as far away from yourself as possible, and hope that if you yell loud enough about someone else's mistakes, no one will notice the blood on your own hands. I've seen it 1,000 times, and it never gets easier to watch because of the collateral damage it does to the children involved. David, her husband, was there too. He was a man who looked like he'd been hollowed out from the inside. He sat on the edge of the sofa, shoulders slumped, looking at Elena with a mixture of confusion and desperate loyalty. He wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her because the alternative was too painful to contemplate. He'd spent their entire marriage trusting her with their finances, their children, and his heart. He didn't realize that while he was out designing skyscrapers, his wife was quietly dismantling the foundation of their lives, one brick at a time. The central problem wasn't a rebellious teenager. The problem was that Elena was a high-functioning addict, but her drug of choice wasn't a powder or a pill. Her drug was validation, fueled by a secret gambling habit that had morphed into a web of financial fraud and systemic deception. To understand how a woman like Elena ends up on a stage in front of millions of people, confessing to things that would make most people shudder, you have to go back to the family of origin. We are all products of our history, whether we like it or not. Elena grew up in a household where fine was the only acceptable answer to how are you. Her father was a high-powered executive who measured love in grade point averages and trophies. If she wasn't perfect, she was invisible. That's a dangerous way to raise a child because it teaches them that their value is performance-based. It creates a hunger for external approval that can never be satiated. She learned early on that if you have a problem, you hide it. You put on the dress, you flash the smile, and you suffer in silence because the shame of being flawed is worse than the pain of the wound itself. She told me about the first time she went to a casino. It started as a girls' night out, a harmless way to blow off some steam. But for Elena, that first hit of the slot machine wasn't about the money. It was about the escape. For the first time in her life, she wasn't David's wife or Chloe's mom or the perfect daughter. She was just a player. When she won a few $100s, her brain lit up like a Christmas tree. It was the ultimate validation, instant, quantifiable, and seemingly easy. But as any gambler will tell you, the house always wins. And it wasn't long before the wins were few and far between, and she was chasing losses with money she didn't have. She started small, a little bit out of the grocery budget, a small loan from the emergency fund that she planned to pay back the next day. But the next day turned into next week, and the hundreds turned into thousands. By the time I met her, she had opened 14 different credit cards in David's name without him knowing. She had intercepted the mail for 3 years, literally running to the mailbox every morning at 10 a.m. to make sure he never saw a past due notice or a foreclosure warning. Think about the energy that takes. Think about the sheer, exhausting vigilance required to live a double life for over 1,000 days. She was living in a state of constant fight or flight, her nervous system fried, her integrity completely eroded. And then there was Chloe. Chloe had figured it out. Not all of it, but enough. She'd seen a statement Elena had missed. She'd heard the hushed, frantic phone calls to creditors. When Chloe tried to confront her mother, Elena did something truly pathological. She turned it around on the girl. She told Chloe she was imagining things, that she was unstable, and eventually she started planting evidence to make David think Chloe was the one stealing money from his wallet. It was gaslighting in its purest, most toxic form. She was willing to sacrifice her daughter's mental health and her relationship with her father just to keep her own mask from slipping. That's when the escalation began. The house wasn't just quiet anymore. It was a war zone of accusations and confusion. David was caught in the middle, a man trying to mediate a fight where he didn't even know what the weapons were. He saw his daughter spiraling, getting into trouble at school, acting out, and he saw his wife heroically trying to manage it. He was being played like a fiddle, and the tragedy was that he was providing the bow. Elena had convinced him that Chloe needed expensive residential treatment, a move that would have conveniently gotten the girl out of the house and away from the truth. That was the tipping point. That was why they were here. Elena thought she was coming on the show to get me to fix Chloe. She thought I'd be another audience member she could charm with her perfect mom routine. She had no idea that I don't listen to what people say. I watch what they do. And what she had been doing was leaving a trail of destruction that led straight back to her chair. The thing about a lie is that it's high maintenance. A truth just sits there. It doesn't require any effort to maintain because it's the bedrock of reality. But a lie is a living, breathing thing that you have to feed every single day. You have to remember what you told person A so it doesn't contradict what you told person B. Elena was exhausted, though she wouldn't admit it. She'd spent years performing what I call financial gymnastics. She wasn't just gambling with money, she was gambling with the very fabric of her family's security. She told me with a straight face that she was doing it for them. She said she wanted to give them a better life, as if a stack of maxed out credit cards and a forged second mortgage was a gift. That's the grand delusion of the addict, the idea that the harm you're doing is actually a form of love. It's a cognitive distortion that allows you to sleep at night while the house is literally burning down around you. I remember sitting in my office before we went to tape, looking at the bank statements my team had managed to recover. It was a roadmap of a disaster. Transfers from savings to checking, cash advances at 3 a.m. from local casinos, payments to debt consolidation companies that were really just more high-interest loans, and then there were the signatures. Elena had become a master forger. She'd signed David's name so many times on legal documents that she probably forgot what her own handwriting looked like. When I looked at those papers, I didn't just see fraud. I saw a woman who had completely disconnected from her moral compass. She traded her integrity for the temporary high of not getting caught. That's a lonely place to be, standing on a pedestal while you're knee-deep in mud, terrified that someone is going to look down. The escalation with Chloe was the most heartbreaking part of the file. Chloe was 16, an age where you're already struggling to find your footing in the world. She'd started noticing things, small things at first, a final notice hidden in the trash, the way her mother's hand shook when the phone rang. When Chloe brought it up, Elena didn't just deny it, she went on the offensive. She told David that Chloe was obsessed with money and was becoming paranoid. She even went so far as to take $500 out of David's dresser and hide it in Chloe's room, then help David find it. Can you imagine the betrayal? To have your own mother frame you for a crime she committed just to protect her own reputation? Chloe started acting out because she was being gaslit in her own home. She felt like she was going crazy because the person who was supposed to be her North Star was intentionally leading her into the woods. When they walked onto the stage, the tension was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. David sat in the middle, physically leaning toward Elena, still trying to be the protector. Chloe sat on the end, as far away from her mother as the chairs would allow, her arms crossed tight over her chest, eyes fixed on the floor. She looked like a girl who had given up on being heard. Elena, on the other hand, was on. She was smiling at the audience, nodding at me, playing the role of the concerned, grieving mother to perfection. She started the segment by saying, "Doctor, Phil, I'm just so worried about my daughter. I don't know where we went wrong. We've given her everything, and she's just throwing it all away. I let her talk. I've learned that if you give a liar enough rope, they'll eventually tie their own knot." I watched David's face as Elena spoke. He was nodding along, his eyes filled with a kind of weary sadness. He was a man who worked 60 hours a week designing structures that were meant to last for centuries, yet he was living in a home built on shifting sand. I asked him, "David, do you believe your daughter is a thief?" He paused, looked at Chloe, then back at me. "The evidence is there, Dr. Phil," he said, his voice cracking. "I want to believe her. I really do. But Elena has shown me the bank records. She's shown me the things Chloe has hidden. It breaks my heart, but I don't know what else to think." That was the moment I realized just how deep the deception went. Elena hadn't just lied to him, she had systematically dismantled his trust in his own child. She had isolated Chloe so completely that the girl had no allies left in the world. That's when I turned to Chloe. I asked her, "Chloe, what's your version of the truth?" She didn't look up, she just whispered, "It doesn't matter. Nobody believes me anyway. She's the perfect mom, remember? I'm just a screw-up." There was such a profound sense of defeat in her voice. It wasn't the anger of a rebellious teen, it was the exhaustion of a victim. I told her, "Well, I'm listening, and I've got a real good bullshit detector, and right now it's screaming at me. So talk to me." She finally looked up, her eyes red and swimming with tears. She started describing the things she'd seen, the late night trips to the ATM, the secret mail pile, the way her mother would find money in her room that she'd never touched. As Chloe spoke, I watched Elena. The mask was starting to slip. The practiced smile stayed, but her eyes went cold. She started interruptive corrections, little jabs like, "Oh, honey, you're confused," or "You know that's not how it happened." It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was trying to manage the narrative in real time right there in front of me. But here's the thing about being on my stage. You aren't in control of the narrative. I am. And I had the one thing Elena didn't think I had, the actual records. I had the paper trail that she thought she had buried. I looked at Elena and said, "You know, Elena, there's an old saying, you can't hide a pregnancy or a cough. Eventually, the truth is going to come out. You've spent a lot of time talking about Chloe's problems. You've labeled her a thief, a liar, and a manipulator. But I want to talk about the 14 credit cards that were opened in David's name over the last 3 years. I want to talk about the $64,000 that disappeared from the college fund. And I want to talk about why your signature is on every single one of those applications. The silence that fell over the studio was deafening. I could see the blood drain from Elena's face. David turned to her, his brow furrowed, his mouth slightly open. He looked like he'd been struck. The perfect facade didn't just crack, it shattered into a million pieces. The silence in that studio was heavy, the kind of silence that feels like it has physical weight. David was staring at the stack of papers in his lap, his hands trembling so violently that the pages were rustling like dry leaves. He looked at one signature, then another, then another. I watched him realize in real time that the woman sitting next to him, the woman he'd shared a bed with for 20 years, was a stranger. Elena didn't move. She didn't blink. She just sat there, frozen in the glare of the studio lights, her perfect mom mask finally slipping to reveal the terrified, hollowed-out woman underneath. I've seen that look before. It's the look of a person who has been running a marathon for a decade and has finally hit a brick wall. I didn't let up. You can't be gentle with a cancer like this. You have to cut it out. I looked her dead in the eye and said, Elena, you didn't just spend the money. You spent your daughter's reputation. You spent your husband's trust. You spent your own soul. And for what? A seat at a blackjack table? A temporary high so you wouldn't have to feel the pressure of being perfect for 5 minutes? She finally looked at me, and for the first time, there was no charm, no deflection. There was just raw, ugly fear. I was going to win it back, she whispered, her voice so thin it barely carried to the microphone. I had a plan, Dr. Phil. I was going to pay it all back before David ever found out. I just needed one more big win. That is the siren song of the addict. Just one more. It's a lie they tell themselves so often that it becomes their reality. I told her, Elena, you've been winning it back for 3 years, and you're $200,000 in the hole. The only thing you've successfully won is a ticket to a life of total isolation. Look at your daughter. Chloe was sobbing now, but it wasn't the sound of a child in trouble. It was the sound of a child who had finally been vindicated. She was leaning forward, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I could see the relief washing over her, even through the pain. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't the rebellious daughter her mother had painted her to be. She was the only person in that house who was living in the real world. David finally spoke, and his voice sounded like it was coming from 1,000 miles away. Elena, how could you? He wasn't yelling. He was broken. I trusted you. I gave you everything. And you framed our daughter? You made me think my own child was a criminal? You watched me cry because I thought I'd failed as a father, and you just let me believe it? Elena tried to reach out for his hand, but he flinched away as if her touch were toxic. That was the moment the home they'd built officially ceased to exist. You can recover from a loss of money. You can even recover from a gambling addiction. But the systematic, cold-blooded gaslighting of a child, that's a bell you can't unring. I leaned in, my voice low and steady. I wanted her to feel the gravity of what she'd done to Chloe's psyche. Elena, do you have any idea what you've done to this girl's brain? You took a 16-year-old girl who is already navigating the hardest years of her life, and you told her that her eyes were lying to her. You told her that her memories were wrong. You made her father, the man she's supposed to look up to, turn his back on her. You didn't just steal money, you stole her safety. You stole her sense of reality. That is a form of psychological abuse that takes years of therapy to unpack. And you did it all to protect an image of a life that wasn't even real to begin with. Elena started to hyperventilate. The perfect blouse was wrinkled now, her hair was coming loose, and the tears were finally flowing. Not the dainty practiced tears she'd used in the past, but the ugly, snot-streaked tears of a person who has finally been caught. I just wanted everyone to be proud of me, she wailed. I couldn't be the one who failed. Everyone looks at us and sees the perfect family. I couldn't let them see. I couldn't let them see I was a loser. I stopped her right there. You aren't a loser because you have a gambling problem, Elena. You're a loser because you chose your ego over your child. You chose the PTA's opinion over your daughter's sanity. That is the choice you made. And you made it every single morning when you walked to that mailbox. The confrontation moved into the how and why, but it wasn't about the mechanics of the fraud anymore. It was about the pathology of her perfectionism. We spent the next hour peeling back the layers of her life. She talked about her father, about the crushing weight of expectation, about the gold star she'd been chasing her entire life. She admitted that she felt like an imposter in her own skin and that the only time she felt alive was when she was at the casino, where the only thing that mattered was the next card. It was a classic case of a woman who had no internal sense of worth, so she tried to manufacture it through external achievements and eventually through the thrill of the gamble. But I wasn't there to just give her a hug and a tissue. I was there to demand accountability. I turned back to David. David, you've been a co-conspirator in this, and you don't even know it. You were so busy looking at the blueprints of buildings that you stopped looking at the blueprints of your own family. You chose the path of least resistance. You saw things that didn't add up, didn't you? You felt the tension. You saw the inconsistencies, but you chose to believe the lie because the truth was too much work. You failed your daughter too by not being the second line of defense she needed when her first line of defense, her mother, turned on her. David bowed his head, the weight of that realization hitting him like a ton of bricks. He knew I was right. His loyalty to Elena had been a form of negligence toward Chloe. The atmosphere on that stage shifted from a show to a surgery. We were cutting through the scar tissue of years of deception. I told Elena that if she wanted to save what was left of her life, she had to stop the performance right now. I told her she had to look Chloe in the eye without any buts or ifs and admit exactly what she'd done. It took her a long time. She fought it. She tried to pivot back to her illness, tried to say the gambling made her do it. I didn't let her. The gambling didn't hide the money in Chloe's dresser. Elena, you did that. The gambling didn't tell David that Chloe was unstable. You did that. Own it, every single bit of it. Finally, Elena turned toward her daughter. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot. She looked at Chloe, who was waiting, hovering between hope and total heartbreak. For the first time in years, Elena spoke the truth without a filter. I did it, Chloe, she said, her voice trembling. I stole the money. I hid it in your room. I lied to your father about you. I made you feel like you were going crazy so I wouldn't have to admit I was a failure. It wasn't you. It was always me. I'm so sorry. It wasn't a fix, but it was a beginning. Chloe didn't run to her. She didn't forgive her on the spot. She just nodded, a single sharp nod of recognition. The truth was finally in the room, and even though it was painful, it was the first time they'd all breathed real air in a very long time. The aftermath of a breakthrough like that is never clean. It's not like a movie where the music swells, the family hugs, and the credits roll while everyone lives happily ever after. Real life is messier, bloodier, and a hell of a lot more exhausting. As we walked off that stage and into the backstage area, the air was still thick with the residue of Elena's confession. David looked like a man who had just survived a plane crash, dazed, pale, and unsure if he was actually standing on solid ground. Chloe was different. She looked lighter, but there was a new kind of hardness in her eyes. The truth had set her free, but it had also shown her exactly who her mother was, and that's a bell you can't unring. You don't just go back to being a perfect family after you've spent years being gaslit by the person who gave you life. I sat them down in a private room away from the cameras. I wanted to see if the mask would try to crawl back onto Elena's face the moment the spotlight was off. It's a common phenomenon. People perform a breakthrough for the audience, but as soon as they're back in the real world, the old defenses start to kick in. I looked at Elena, who was huddled in a chair, her expensive blouse stained with tears and makeup. I didn't see the PTA president anymore. I saw a scared, middle-aged woman who had gambled away her family's future and her own integrity. I told her, Elena, what happened out there was the first honest 10 minutes of your life in over a decade. But don't think for 1 second that saying I'm sorry is the end of the road. It's the first inch of a 1,000-mile hike, and most of it is uphill. She looked at me, her eyes hollow. What do I do now, Dr. Phil? David won't even look at me. Chloe, she looks at me like I'm a monster. I leaned in close. Well, let's be honest, Elena. To Chloe, you have been a monster. You've been the person who tried to steal her mind. You have to accept that. You have to sit in the fire of their resentment and not try to put it out with more lies. You don't get to ask for forgiveness today. You don't even get to ask for a hug. What you get to do is go to a residential treatment facility for gambling addiction, and you get to start the long, painful process of figure out why you think your value is tied to a lie. I turned to David. He was sitting on the edge of his chair, staring at the floor. He was a man who lived by the rules of physics and engineering, load-bearing walls, structural integrity, blueprints. He didn't know how to handle a situation where the foundation itself was a hallucination. David, I said, you're a good man, but you've been an ostrich. You've had your head in the sand because you didn't want to see what was right in front of you. You're going to have to decide if you want to rebuild this house or if the damage is so structural that you have to tear it down and start over. And either way, your first priority isn't your marriage. It's your daughter. You owe her a massive apology for not believing her when she was screaming for help. David nodded slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. I know, he whispered. I failed her. I saw things, Dr. Phil. I saw the way Elena would jump when the phone rang. I saw the final notice letters and I let her tell me they were mistakes from the bank. I wanted to believe the perfect version of our life so badly that I sacrificed my daughter's sanity for it. I'll never forgive myself for that. I told him that guilt is only useful if it drives change. Don't just sit there and feel bad, David. Do something about it. Get your daughter into individual therapy with someone who specializes in trauma and gaslighting. Give her a safe space where she doesn't have to worry about being lied to. And for God's sake, take over the finances today, not tomorrow, today. The plan I laid out for them was rigorous. Elena was going to a top-tier facility that dealt with dual diagnosis, gambling addiction, and the underlying personality disorders that fueled her need for perfection and validation. David and Chloe were going into intensive family therapy, but separately from Elena for a while. They needed time to heal without her presence. Chloe needed to know that her father was 100% on her team with no split loyalties. I told Elena that if she really loved them, she would go away and do the work without complaining, without calling them every 5 minutes to ask for another chance. True love in this case was absence. It was giving them the space to breathe without her smog. Over the next few weeks, I kept tabs on them through my team. Elena went to the facility. The reports from her therapist were grim at first. She struggled with the loss of status. She hated being in a place where she was just another addict, where her PTA president title meant nothing. She tried to manipulate the staff, tried to be the star patient who had it all figured out after 3 days. But they were pros. They saw through her. They made her scrub floors. They made her sit in group therapy and listen to the stories of people she used to look down on. They forced her to see that her perfection was just a high-end version of the same desperation that drives a person to huddle in a doorway with a needle in their arm. It was a brutal, ego-stripping, and it was exactly what she needed. Back home, David and Chloe were having a different kind of struggle. David had to face the cold, hard reality of the numbers. When he finally got full access to all the accounts, he found that they were even deeper in the hole than we had thought. There was a second mortgage he hadn't known about and several high-interest predatory loans. They were on the verge of losing the house. But strangely, as the financial walls were closing in, the emotional walls between him and Chloe were coming down. They had to move into a smaller apartment. They had to sell the luxury cars. They had to live a life that was far from perfect by suburban standards, but for the first time, it was an honest life. Chloe started to thrive in a way she never had before. Without the constant weight of her mother's gaslighting, her grades improved. Her rebellious behavior, which had really just been a cry for help, evaporated. She started talking to David again. They would sit in their small apartment, eating takeout on the floor because they hadn't bought a new dining table yet, and they would actually talk. No secrets, no don't tell your mother, no you're imagining thing. Just two people trying to navigate a disaster together. David told my producer that he'd never felt closer to his daughter, even when they lived in a 5-bedroom house with a pool. It's a powerful lesson. You can't build a relationship on a foundation of lies, no matter how beautiful the house looks from the street. The road for Elena was much longer. Addiction to the image is one of the hardest things to break because it's reinforced by society every day. We live in a world that tells us to fake it till we make it. And Elena had just taken that to its logical, destructive conclusion. In rehab, she finally hit rock bottom when David sent her a letter saying he was filing for legal separation. He wasn't doing it to be cruel. He was doing it because he had to protect what was left of his and Chloe's future. He couldn't be legally tied to her financial gymnastics anymore. That was the moment the reality finally sunk in for Elena. She wasn't just in trouble. She had effectively dismantled her entire world. She had no house, no husband, and a daughter who didn't want to speak to her. That's when the real work started, the work that isn't for the cameras, but for the soul. 6 months later, I found myself sitting in my office looking at a photo David had sent me. It wasn't a professional portrait like the ones they used to have, the kind where everyone's wearing matching sweaters and forced smiles. It was a candid shot of him and Chloe at a local diner sharing a burger. They both looked tired, their clothes weren't designer, and the lighting was terrible, but there was something in their eyes I hadn't seen on that stage: peace. They weren't performing for anyone. They weren't trying to sell a version of their lives to the world. They were just a father and a daughter surviving the wreckage and finding a way to be okay with who they actually were. It's a powerful thing when you stop living for the neighbors and start living for yourself. Elena's journey was significantly more arduous. When she finally walked out of that treatment facility, she didn't have a luxury SUV waiting for her. She didn't have a husband to take her home to a suburban mansion. She had a bus ticket and a spot in a structured, sober living environment. For a woman who had defined her entire existence by status, This was a brutal, daily confrontation with her own choices. I spoke to her on the phone shortly after her release. She sounded different, her voice was lower, slower, and lacked that frantic, chirpy energy she used to use to deflect criticism. She told me she was working at a local retail chain, making minimum wage, and spending her evenings in support groups. She said something that really stuck with me. She said, "Dr. Phil, for 20 years, I was terrified that someone would find out I wasn't perfect. Now that everyone knows I'm a mess, I finally feel like I can breathe." That's the irony of the secret life. The secret is a cage, and the truth is the key. But we're often too afraid of the cold air outside to turn the lock. Elena had lost her marriage, her home, and her reputation, but she had gained a soul. She was finally doing the one thing she'd been running from her entire life, being honest with herself. She wasn't fixing things to win David back. She was fixing things because she realized that her old way of living was a slow-motion suicide. David and Elena did not reconcile. That's the part that hurts people to hear sometimes, but it's the truth. You can forgive someone and still realize that they aren't safe to have in your life. David had to set a boundary for his own sanity and for Chloe's. He told Elena that he would support her recovery from a distance, but the marriage was a casualty of the war she'd waged against the truth. It was a hard, clean break. He realized that his loyalty had been a form of enabling, and he wasn't going to make that mistake again. He was learning how to be a parent who protects his child, even if that means protecting her from the other parent. Chloe was the one who surprised everyone. She didn't become bitter, though she had every right to be. Instead, she became a voice for other kids who were being gaslit by their parents. She started a small blog, writing about her experiences with the perfect mom and how she found her way back to reality. She told me that the hardest part wasn't the money her mother stole, it was the stolen years of trust. She and Elena began having supervised therapy sessions once a month. There were no big hugs, no I love yous right away, just a mother sitting across from a daughter finally telling the truth about what happened. It was awkward, it was painful, and it was exactly what needed to happen. The tragedy of this case isn't just the gambling or the fraud. The real tragedy is how many people are living some version of Elena's lie right now. Maybe it's not $200,000 in gambling debt. Maybe it's a secret drinking problem, an affair, or just a deep, abiding unhappiness that they cover up with a perfect Instagram feed. We've become a culture of taxidermists. We take something that's dead or dying and we stuff it and pose it so it looks like it's still alive. But you can't have a relationship with a statue. You can only have a relationship with a person. And people are flawed, messy, and occasionally broken. I think about Elena often when I talk to families who are struggling with rebellious kids. I always tell them to look for the leak. If a child is acting out, they are usually reacting to a pressure in the home that no one is talking about. Chloe wasn't the problem. She was the whistleblower. She was the one pointing at the fire while everyone else was complimenting the wallpaper. It takes a lot of courage to be the only person in a house who refuses to look away from the truth, especially when the people you love are trying to convince you that you're crazy. The outcome for this family wasn't a happily ever after, but it was a truthfully ever after. Elena is still in recovery, one day at a time, learning that she doesn't need a gold star to have value. David is learning that being a good provider means more than just a paycheck. It means being an emotional guardian for his family. And Chloe is growing into a woman who knows that her voice matters and that she never has to let someone else define her reality again. They are three individuals who had to let a fake family die so that three real people could finally live. As I told them on the last day we spoke, you don't change what you don't acknowledge. Elena finally acknowledged her demons, and in doing so, She gave her family the only gift she had left, the truth. It's a heavy gift, and it's one that changes everything it touches. But it's the only thing that can actually set you free. The truth is a standard, and once you decide to live by it, you find out very quickly who belongs in your life and who was just there for the show. For Elena, the show is over, and the real life has finally begun. It's a quiet life, a humbler life, but for the first time in her 42 years, it's hers. And that, in my book, is a win that no casino could ever provide.